There is something in your portfolio that you have never once looked at. Not because you forgot, not because it is hidden in some account you do not have access to, but because nobody told you it was there. And the people who design the systems you live inside, the career ladders, the savings plans, the advice columns, the retirement calculators, they have a very specific incentive to keep your attention on everything else. Here is the contradiction this book is built on. Every asset you have been told to build has a ceiling. Your salary hits a ceiling. Your skill set reaches a point of diminishing return. Even money itself, compounding in the most optimized portfolio a financial advisor can construct, is bounded by the number of years you are alive to let it grow. These ceilings are real. They are mathematical, and the entire architecture of conventional financial advice exists inside them. But there is one asset that obeys none of those laws. It cannot be taxed. It cannot be seized in a market correction. It does not depreciate when you sleep. And unlike every other form of capital you carry, the more of it you develop, the faster it grows, not linearly, not predictably, but in ways that restructure the returns on every other asset you own simultaneously. Most people will never invest a single deliberate hour in it. You are about to find out why that is the most expensive mistake a person can make, and precisely how to stop making it. What you are going to hear is not a repackaging of what you already know. It will require you to look at your life, and at your mind, as something you have been severely undervaluing. By the end, that will no longer be possible. Chapter 1. Every financial asset has a ceiling except one. There is a pattern woven through every era of human history, visible in every society that ever rose, plateaued, and fell. In every age, a small number of people seem to operate from a different set of rules than everyone around them. They did not always start with more. They were not always the sharpest or the most connected, but something inside them worked differently. It processed the world differently. It generated results that compounded in ways the people around them could not fully explain. Most people throughout history explained this gap by pointing at resources, land, gold, connections, timing. They were almost always pointing at the wrong thing. What you are about to hear is not a financial strategy. It is something older, something that will quietly reorganize the way you see every decision you make, with money, with time, with your own attention. You are listening right now because some part of you already suspects that what you have been told about building wealth is incomplete. That suspicion is correct. By the end of this chapter, you will understand exactly where the gap is. Picture two people. Call them Marcus and Dana. Same age, 28, same city, same starting portfolio, call it $40,000 each, sitting in index funds. Same job, roughly, same rent, roughly. You could look at their financial snapshots side by side and see almost no difference. Now fast forward 10 years. Marcus has grown his portfolio to around $90,000. Decent, steady. He followed the advice he was given, contributed regularly, did not panic sell during downturns. On paper, he did everything right. But something strange kept happening. Every time an opportunity appeared, a business his friend pitched, a real estate deal that required creative thinking, a career pivot that asked him to see himself differently, Marcus hesitated. He analyzed. He waited for certainty that never came. The opportunities passed. New ones arrived. He hesitated again. His money compounded at roughly the rate the market gave him and nothing more. Dana, at the same age, with the same $40,000, now holds a net worth closer to $400,000. Not because she got lucky, not because she had information Marcus did not have. The market gave her the same returns it gave him. But Dana spent those 10 years investing in something Marcus never touched, something that changed which opportunities she could even see, let alone take, something that changed how she read risk, how she read people, how she read herself under pressure. Her financial assets grew because the person managing them grew first. Here is the question that should be sitting in your mind right now. What exactly did Dana invest in that Marcus did not? Hold that question. The answer is coming, but not yet. First, you need to feel the full weight of what this distinction actually costs people. You have probably been told that the path to financial security runs through three things: money, which you invest in assets that appreciate; skill, which you develop to increase your earning power; and status, which opens doors that skill and money alone cannot. These three levers are real. Nobody here is arguing they do not matter. But each of them carries a ceiling that most people never talk about. Talking about the ceiling feels defeatist, and the people selling you courses on those three levers have no interest in you discovering where the limits are. Money compounds within market constraints. The market has good years and brutal years. The average long-term return is something in the range of 7 to 10% annually in a healthy economy. That is real. That is valuable. But it is bounded. It cannot give you 30% because your thinking improved. The market does not know who you are. It does not reward clarity or courage or the ability to see patterns that other people miss. It pays the same rate to every dollar regardless of the consciousness behind it. Skill compounds within demand constraints. You can become extraordinarily good at something, and if the world's demand for that thing contracts, your skill stops compounding. The demand curve is outside your control. You can become the finest practitioner of something the market no longer needs, and the compounding stops cold. Status compounds within social constraints. It accumulates slowly and erodes quickly. It is entirely dependent on other people's perceptions in a landscape that shifts without warning. You can spend years building a reputation and watch it become irrelevant when the environment changes. 3 assets, 3 ceilings. And here is what nobody says out loud. Most people spend their entire working lives pressing against those ceilings, confused about why the returns keep slowing, convinced they must not be working hard enough when the actual problem is structural. Call up the person you were from 3 years back before hindsight edits it. Not abstractly, actually picture it. The apartment, the account balance, the conversations you were having with yourself late at night about money. Now ask yourself honestly, how much of the progress or lack of progress since then came from the market, from your skills, from your connections, and how much came from a change in the way you think? Most people, when they sit with that question long enough, realize the external assets moved slowly. The real leaps came when something internal shifted first. You already know this. You have just never been handed a framework for it. Here is a woman named Clara. She grew up watching her father manage a hardware store that barely survived. By the time she was 32, she had spent a decade telling herself a story about money, that it was scarce, that it required grinding, that wanting more than you needed was a form of selfishness. She made decent money as a project manager, saved a reasonable amount. Her financial advisor told her she was on track. on track for what she never quite asked. One afternoon, driving home from a performance review where she had been praised but not promoted, she had a single quiet thought. She thought, "I keep arriving at the same ceiling because I am not thinking above it." She did not know what to do with that thought yet, but she did not let go of it. Over the next 18 months, Clara began treating her thinking as an asset with a return. She started reading outside her field, not for information but for pattern recognition. She started asking, in every situation, not just what she should do, but why she was reading the situation the way she was, and whether that reading was accurate or inherited. Small questions, cheap in time, free in money, invisible to everyone around her. And then her results began to behave differently. Not dramatically, not overnight. A negotiation she expected to lose, she won because she walked in with a different internal posture. A business idea she would have dismissed 3 years earlier, she evaluated clearly and pursued. The market had not changed. Her skills on paper had not changed dramatically. Her consciousness had changed, and it was pulling everything else upward behind it. That is the pattern. Here is the core of it, stated plainly. Consciousness is the only asset that compounds without a ceiling. It does not operate inside any external constraint. The market cannot limit it. Demand cannot cap it. It does not depreciate when the economy contracts or when a competitor enters your space. And unlike money, skill, or status, consciousness cannot be taxed, cannot be seized, cannot be inflated away. It is yours with a permanence that no other asset class can match. Every financial decision you have ever made was filtered through your current level of consciousness at the time you made it. That means the decisions that cost you were not failures of information or luck. They were outputs of a particular way of seeing, which means they can be changed at the root. This is what Marcus missed. Not a better broker, not more discipline with contributions. Marcus missed the understanding that the person making the decisions is the first investment, and everything else is downstream. As this book keeps moving, we will get to a point about discipline and financial progress that cuts across the standard story. When that point settles, it alters how you act on a daily basis. But right now, the thing to understand is this. You are not behind because your assets are too small. You are not behind because you missed the right opportunities. You carry an invisible portfolio that no one has ever asked you to look at. It has been compounding, or failing to compound, this entire time, completely unmanaged. The question that determines everything else you will read in this book is not how much you have. The question is, who is managing the person who manages everything? Chapter 2. You have been investing in the depreciating assets. Everyone believes the answer to financial pressure is acquiring more assets, more skills, more income streams, more certificates on the wall, more diversification in the portfolio. Most people listening to something like this right now hold that belief firmly. They are wrong, not partially wrong. Wrong in the direction that costs them the most time, the most energy, and the most of what they cannot get back. This belief feels solid because the people and systems teaching it are measuring the wrong thing entirely. Before this chapter ends, you will understand what is actually depreciating in your financial life, and you will not be able to unsee it. The question from the first chapter was this: who is managing the person who manages everything? Hold that question. It will matter more by the end of this chapter than it does right now. Here is what most financial education produces. It produces a person who knows what to buy and has no idea who is doing the buying. courses on investing, content on passive income, advice on tax strategy, all of it assumes the most important variable is already optimized. It assumes you, the investor, are ready. It assumes the person making the decisions is not the hidden risk. That assumption is where the real losses begin. Think about the last significant financial decision you made, not the math behind it. Think about the state you were in when you made it. Were you calm or reactive? Were you clear or clouded by comparison to someone else's visible success? Were you patient or chasing? The decision itself is almost secondary. The consciousness behind the decision is where the outcome was already being written. This is the open question that will sharpen as this chapter moves forward. If your awareness is the instrument that operates all your other instruments, what happens when the instrument itself has not been maintained? You have been investing. You have been putting real time and real money into things the world told you were assets, and in many ways they are. A skill is real. A savings account is real. A small business is real. But every one of those things carries a hidden cost embedded inside it. A cost that only becomes visible when the market changes, the economy contracts, or the technology shifts. When that moment comes, the differentiating factor is never the asset. It is always the person holding the asset. Consider Marcus. He spent 11 years building a career in mortgage lending. Smart man, genuinely skilled, respected by colleagues. By 2006, he had cultivated a network, earned certifications, developed a reliable income, and accumulated what he would have called a strong professional portfolio. He had invested heavily in the external architecture of a stable life. Then 2008 arrived. The crash did not care about Marcus's certifications. It did not care about his network or his reputation inside the company that no longer needed him. Every external asset he had spent 11 years building was now worth a fraction of what it had been. Some of it was worth nothing at all. He was 41 years old, staring at a resume full of expertise in an industry that had collapsed, inside an economy reorganizing itself faster than he could respond. Here is what happened next. This is the part most people telling this kind of story leave out. Some of Marcus's colleagues recovered quickly. Within 2 years, they had moved into adjacent industries, built new income streams, and in several cases ended up in stronger financial positions than before the crash. Others with nearly identical external credentials and portfolios spent 4 to 6 years recovering. A few never fully did. The credentials were the same. The external assets were comparably damaged. What was different? The people who recovered fastest were not the ones with the most diversified portfolios before the crash. They were the ones who had, in the years before, been doing something harder to name and easier to ignore. They had been reading outside their industry. They had been sitting with discomfort and learning to think inside it. They had been examining their own assumptions, noticing their own patterns, questioning their own certainties. They had been, without knowing to call it this, investing in their own consciousness. That is not a soft claim. It is a structural one. When the external environment changes faster than your external assets can adapt, the only instrument you have left is the quality of your own perception. And if you have never invested in that, you have nothing flexible enough to move with the moment. Now here is what this means for you, right now, in the life you are actually living. Bring to mind the person you were from 3 years back before hindsight edits it. The skills you were building, the goals you were chasing, the version of success you were picturing. Ask yourself honestly, how much of your investment in those 3 years went into external things, and how much went into the quality of your own awareness? Not therapy, not meditation as a brand, not self-help as a habit. Actual investment in how clearly you perceive your own choices, how honestly you evaluate your own results, how consciously you manage your own attention. For most people, the honest answer is almost none, and this is not a character flaw. It is a curriculum failure. Nobody taught you this. The financial content you consumed measured portfolio returns. The career content measured promotions and salary increases. The personal development content measured habits and morning routines. Nobody handed you a metric for consciousness growth and showed you its compounding curve. So you did what any reasonable person does when given a map. You followed the map you had, but maps only work if they include all the relevant terrain. Here is the terrain the map left out. Every skill you develop has a shelf life. That shelf life gets shorter every year as technology accelerates and markets restructure. Every certificate you earn is a signal that can be replicated by someone younger, cheaper, or operating in a country where the cost of labor is a fraction of yours. Every dollar you accumulate loses purchasing power to inflation every single year. These are not pessimistic observations. They are structural facts about how external assets behave. Consciousness does not work this way. Genuine clarity of perception does not depreciate. The capacity to see your own blind spots and correct for them does not go stale. The ability to think clearly under pressure, to remain honest with yourself when the numbers are disappointing, to hold long-time horizons when the moment demands short thinking. None of this loses value with time. It compounds. Each layer of real self-knowledge makes the next layer more accessible. Each accurate self-correction makes the next one faster. This is the only asset that cannot be taxed, cannot be stolen, cannot be inflated away, and cannot be automated out of relevance. The invisible portfolio is what you are building with your consciousness. Most people never open the account. They invest everything into the visible portfolio and wonder why, despite all the diversification, despite all the right financial moves on paper, they keep arriving at the same emotional and economic ceilings. The ceiling is not the asset. The ceiling is the investor. This is the diagnosis this chapter is built around. You have been investing in the depreciating assets, not because you are careless. Because the depreciating assets are the ones with price tags, with courses attached, with LinkedIn endorsements and quarterly statements. They are measurable in the language the world gave you. Consciousness investment has none of that language yet, which is exactly why the people who discover it early hold an advantage that no market crash can erase. In a later section, we will get to a point about what hard work actually builds that cuts across the standard story. After that really registers, it alters what you choose to spend effort on. Marcus eventually recovered. He moved into financial counseling, working with families who had lost homes in the crash. He later said the most valuable thing that period had given him was not a new skill. It was a new honesty about what he had been avoiding in himself. That honesty, once developed, became the thing no economic cycle could touch. He described it once as finally having something in his portfolio that the market could not price. He had stumbled into the invisible portfolio. You do not have to stumble. Every hour you invest in external assets without parallel investment in the consciousness operating those assets is diversification into instruments that all carry the same hidden risk. The risk is you, unchanged. That is not a harsh conclusion. It is the most useful one you will encounter in this book. Because the moment you see the unchanged investor as the primary variable, you stop asking only how to improve your portfolio. You start asking something far more powerful. Who is the investor becoming? Chapter 3. Consciousness is measurable and you can grow it. Thinking harder makes you less intelligent. That sounds like the kind of thing you dismiss in the first 3 seconds, but it is not a riddle or a paradox designed to sound clever. It is a precise, documented observation about what happens when perception becomes strained, when your internal instrument is running at low resolution, when the very act of pushing harder against a problem creates distortion instead of clarity. The question that should form in your mind is this: if thinking harder can reduce the quality of what you perceive, what is the real variable? Not the problem in front of you, not the information available to you. You. Specifically, the precision of the instrument you are using to read reality. That instrument is your consciousness. And unlike your salary or your credit score or even your skill set, it can be measured, trained, and grown with the same rigor you would apply to any investment worth making. That question, the real variable, is the open door this chapter walks you through. The previous chapter ended with a deceptively simple question. Who is the investor becoming? Not what are they buying? Not what returns are they chasing? Who are they becoming in the act of building? That question is not philosophical decoration. It is the most financially important question in this entire book. The answer determines the ceiling of everything else you will ever accumulate. You can double your income and still make the exact same decisions that kept you poor before, because the instrument you are using to make those decisions has not changed. The money changed. You did not. Here is where most people stop. They reach some new financial marker, feel a brief rush of arrival, and then slowly discover that their problems have simply repriced themselves. The debt that used to be $4,000 is now $40,000. The anxiety that used to live in their checking account now lives in their investment portfolio. The pattern is identical, only the numbers are different. This is not bad luck. This is low-resolution perception wearing expensive clothes. Go back to the person you were from 3 years back before hindsight edits it. Not financially, go deeper than that. Think about how you interpreted the events around you, how quickly you assumed the worst, how long bad news stayed in your body, how often you made decisions from reaction rather than consideration. Now think honestly about whether the framework you used to read the world then is the same framework you are still using today. For most people, the answer is closer to yes than they want to admit. The external circumstances may have shifted. The internal instrument often has not. That is the cost nobody puts in a spreadsheet. A researcher named David Hawkins spent decades mapping human consciousness, not as a spiritual exercise, but as a measurable phenomenon. He proposed that human awareness operates across a spectrum, that different levels of perception literally produce different lived realities for the person experiencing them. Whatever you believe about his methodology, the observation beneath the research is worth sitting with. People operating from fear make categorically different decisions than people operating from curiosity. People whose base emotional state is shame read neutral events as threats. People whose internal baseline is confidence read the same neutral events as data. The world does not change between those two people. The instrument does. Ken Wilber, approaching the same territory from a different direction, built what he called an integral framework, a map of how human development moves through increasingly complex and inclusive stages of perception. His core insight, stripped of all the academic architecture, is this: each time a person develops to a new stage of consciousness, they do not simply learn new information. They gain access to new categories of information that were invisible to them before. The previous stage was not wrong, exactly. It was lower resolution. like trying to navigate a city using a map drawn before half the streets existed. You have done this yourself, even if you did not have language for it. There was a version of you who read a certain kind of person as threatening. Then something happened, a conversation, a failure, a book, a long drive alone, and you suddenly saw that person differently. Not because they changed, because your capacity to perceive them expanded. That moment was a consciousness upgrade. It was also completely free, and it changed how you acted, which changed what you built, which changed your actual material circumstances. That is compounding. Not the slow, quiet compounding of interest sitting in an index fund. The sharp, geometric compounding that happens when the instrument doing the perceiving gets more precise. One clearer decision in a high-stakes moment does not just produce one better outcome. It produces a different downstream trajectory. The investors who bought Apple in 2003 did not just get Apple returns. They got the confidence that recalibrated how they evaluated every subsequent opportunity. The internal change was the real asset. The stock was the proof. Now consider the inverse. This is the part most financial content refuses to address because it is uncomfortable. How many clear financial signals have you already received in your life that you simply could not see? Not because the information was hidden, because the instrument you were using was not calibrated to receive it. The right opportunity at the wrong level of consciousness looks like noise. It looks like risk or arrogance or someone else's story. The limitation was not the market. The limitation was the resolution of the lens. There is a woman named Priya who grew up in the same neighborhood as her cousin Marcus. Same school, same family dinners, same starting conditions by almost any measurement. Marcus built a contracting business by the time he was 32, sold it, and began investing in real estate. Priya spent those same 12 years working at 3 different companies, earning competitive salaries, and arrived at 32 with a smaller net worth than she had at 28. Not because of discipline. Priya was more disciplined than Marcus in almost every traditional metric. She worked longer hours. She spent less. She read more business books than he ever did. The difference was not information. Both of them had access to the same ideas. The difference was where those ideas landed inside each person. Marcus had spent years in deliberately uncomfortable situations, managing difficult clients, negotiating contracts he had no real experience in, sitting in rooms where he was clearly the least credentialed person present. Each of those experiences refined something in him that did not show up on any resume. He had trained his instrument without knowing that was what he was doing. When a distressed property came across his path at 29, something in him read it accurately. The numbers, yes, but also the timing, the risk, the human element of the seller's situation. Priya saw the same type of deal 2 years later and walked away. Not because she was less intelligent, because her instrument had not been exposed to the same calibration experiences. She tells the story now with clarity rather than regret, which is itself evidence of a different kind of growth. The point is not that one path was right and one was wrong. The point is that what Marcus built first, the thing that made the sale possible and the investment legible, was invisible to every external measure. His net worth did not reflect it. His resume did not list it. His consciousness had grown, and everything that followed was a product of that growth compounding forward. This is the asset that cannot be taxed, not because it sits in some offshore account, because it is not recorded anywhere. Nobody can seize what they cannot categorize. Your ability to perceive a room accurately, to read a negotiation clearly, to know the difference between a pattern and an anomaly, These produce real financial results, and they live entirely inside the instrument you carry into every room. Here is the operational definition, stated plainly. Consciousness is not a spiritual state. It is the precision of your perception instrument at any given moment. Higher consciousness does not mean calmer or kinder, though those can be byproducts. It means you see more of what is actually there. You catch more data. You process it with fewer distortions. You respond to what is real rather than to the story your past experience has scripted over the top of it, and it can be measured. Not perfectly, not with the precision of a blood test, but directionally and meaningfully. You can measure it by the quality of your decisions under pressure, by how quickly accurate information reaches your awareness when you have a stake in the outcome, by the gap between your first emotional interpretation of a situation and the interpretation that turns out to be true. The smaller that gap, the higher your resolution. The larger the gap, the more your instrument is running on old calibration data. The compound interest formula from the earlier part of this book applies here with a crucial difference. Financial compounding requires principal that can be taxed, inflated away, or lost in a bad quarter. Consciousness compounding requires only one thing: deliberate exposure to increasing levels of reality complexity. Every time you put yourself in a situation your current instrument cannot yet read fluently and stay present long enough to learn the grammar, you have made a deposit into the only portfolio that never stops growing. Before long, we will get to a point about the relationship between effort and results that cuts across the standard story. Once that becomes real to you, it alters how you decide what to work on. For now, understand this. The instrument is the investment. Growing the instrument is the strategy. Everything else, the skills, the capital, the network, those are outputs. They are what a well-calibrated instrument produces when it encounters good raw material. The question that sharpens everything you have just heard is the same question that opens the next chapter. What exactly causes your instrument to stop growing? Chapter 4. Perception width determines opportunity access. Right now, something is leaving your life that you cannot see leaving. Not money exactly, not time in the obvious sense. What is leaving is opportunity, real, specific, actionable opportunity, and it is passing through your field of vision every single day without registering. You do not notice it because your perceptual field is not wide enough to catch it. And the brutal truth about missed opportunity is this: it does not announce itself as missed. It just looks like an ordinary Tuesday. It looks like a conversation you half listened to. It looks like an article you skimmed. It looks like a person you wrote off in the first 30 seconds. The cost of that narrowness compounds. Every day your perception stays the same width. The gap between what you could see and what you do see grows. Not because the world is hiding things from you, because the instrument you are using to read the world has not been trained to receive them. That instrument has a name. This chapter is about how wide you have made it and what it costs you when the answer is not wide enough. That question the last chapter left you with, what causes your instrument to stop growing, has more than one answer. But the most important answer, the one that runs underneath every other explanation, is this: a narrow perceptual field. When you cannot see widely, you cannot grow deliberately. And when you cannot grow deliberately, the instrument stays fixed while the world keeps moving. Here is what most people believe about how successful people get ahead. They believe it is about credentials, degrees, networks, capital. And those things matter, they are real, they create real leverage. But here is what that explanation misses entirely. Two people can walk into the same room with identical credentials and leave with completely different futures. Not because one worked harder, not because one was luckier, but because one of them saw things in that room that the other one never registered. One of them had a wider perceptual field. And the opportunity that one of them walked out with was sitting in plain sight the entire time. This is the open question sitting at the center of this chapter. Why do some people consistently see more in the same environment? Not imagine more, not hope for more, actually see more. Hold that question. The answer is not what you expect it to be, and you will need to feel the full weight of what we are about to cover before it lands correctly. Marcus worked in the logistics division of a regional distribution company. No MBA, no prestigious background. He had a state university degree in business administration and a reputation among his peers for being, as they put it, unusually observant. That was the whole description. Unusually observant. It sounded like a minor personality trait, something mildly polite to say about a quiet man. It was not. Over 6 years, Marcus was promoted past 11 people with advanced degrees, better titles, and stronger professional networks than he had. His company's leadership eventually paid a consulting firm $40,000 to figure out what Marcus was doing differently. The consultants spent 3 months shadowing the team. Their report came back with a conclusion that confused almost everyone who read it. Marcus, they wrote, processes environmental data at a significantly wider aperture than his peers. He notices what others filter out, and what he notices he uses. Nobody knew what to do with that report, but you should pay close attention to it. What the consultants were describing in their careful professional language was perception width. Marcus had spent years, quietly, without announcement, doing things that expanded his perceptual field while everyone around him invested in conventional credentials. He read outside his industry obsessively, not to collect facts, but to build what he later called pattern libraries. He practiced a form of deliberate observation he had read about in an old book on military strategy. Every time he walked into a new room, he gave himself 60 seconds to notice as much as he could without judgment, without filtering for relevance. He asked questions in meetings that other people thought were slightly off topic, because he was pulling threads from domains that his colleagues had never considered adjacent. He was not smarter than the people he outperformed. He had simply trained himself to receive more of reality than they had. And receiving more of reality is the same thing as having access to more opportunity. Remember the person you were from 3 years back, before hindsight edits it. Think about the things you were worried about, the decisions that felt enormous, the problems that seemed like walls. Now think about how some of those walls look from where you stand today. They probably look smaller. Not because the world changed, but because you changed. Because you can see around them now in ways you could not then. That shift, that widening of what you can perceive, happened because something in your life expanded your perceptual field. Maybe it was a hard experience. Maybe it was a book or a conversation or a year of trying something that failed. Whatever it was, it made you capable of seeing more. Now ask yourself, what would happen if you did that deliberately instead of waiting for life to force it on you? The answer is Marcus. Here is the mechanism, and it is worth understanding precisely. Your brain, at any given moment, is receiving roughly 11 million bits of information per second from your senses. It consciously processes about 40 of them. 40. The rest is filtered out before it ever reaches your awareness. That filter is not random. It is built from your existing mental models, your past experiences, your learned assumptions about what is relevant. Your brain is not showing you reality. It is showing you its best guess about which parts of reality matter. And if your mental models are narrow, if they were built from a limited range of experience and exposure, then your filter throws away opportunities the way a poor net throws away fish. Wider perception means a finer net. More gets through. This is why the wealthiest people in any room are not always the most educated. Education matters. But a conventional education, pursued through conventional means in a conventional sequence, tends to produce a well-reinforced set of mental models that are good at the domain they trained for and blind to nearly everything adjacent. The person who has deliberately trained their perceptual field, who has pressed into discomfort, crossed domains, practiced noticing, sat with contradictions, that person is fishing with a different net. They catch things the credentialed person walks right past. And here is the part that connects to everything this book is building toward. The opportunity you catch with wider perception, you can act on. The opportunity you cannot perceive might as well not exist. This is not a metaphor. It is a literal description of your decision space. You cannot choose an option you do not see. You cannot pursue a connection you did not notice. You cannot leverage a pattern you did not recognize. Your perception width is your opportunity access, not approximately, exactly. Now here is where the invisible portfolio comes back in. Every investment you make in expanding your perceptual field, every book read outside your comfort zone, every conversation pursued past the point of easy understanding, every deliberate attempt to see a situation from a vantage point that is not your natural one, every one of those is a deposit into an asset that compounds silently. Every other asset you own is subject to market forces, inflation, taxes, and time. Your perceptual field cannot be audited. It cannot be taxed. It cannot be taken in a market correction. And unlike a stock, the more you invest in it, the higher its capacity to generate returns. Because returns on perception come in the form of opportunity spotted, and opportunity compounded becomes everything else. Marcus, by the way, eventually left that distribution company. He started a small logistics consulting firm with 2 former colleagues, and a client list he had assembled over years of conversations that everyone else in his division had considered tangential. Within 4 years, that firm was billing more annually than his salary would have been in a decade. The consulting report that had confused his former employers made perfect sense to him. He had not gotten lucky. He had expanded his aperture, caught what others filtered out, and built with what he caught. The question from earlier, why do some people consistently see more in the same environment, has its answer now. They see more because they train themselves to receive more, not once, consistently, as a practice, as a discipline that is no different in its structure from the discipline of investing money. You put something in, you let it compound. You do not spend the principal on impressing people. You protect the asset and let it work. Down the line in this book, we will get to a point about focus. The idea that narrowing your attention is always the path to greater results that cuts across the standard story. When that idea snaps into focus, it alters how you decide where to direct your energy every single morning. But that is ahead of you. Right now, what matters is this. The width of your perceptual field is not fixed. It is trainable. It responds to investment the way any good asset does. And the return it offers is not abstract satisfaction or personal growth in the soft sense of the phrase. The return is access. Access to patterns, to connections, to openings that are invisible to people operating with narrower instruments. You do not need more credentials to widen your field. You need more deliberate exposure, more practiced noticing, more willingness to sit with ideas that feel foreign until they start to feel familiar. That is the investment. It is available to you right now. It costs less than a course and returns more than a degree. Marcus saw what the room held, and the room was never hiding it. The question is not whether opportunity is in front of you. The question is how wide your instrument is set. Chapter 5. Fear contracts consciousness every single time. Thinking more clearly is not a luxury. It is the single most profitable activity available to you right now. That sounds like the kind of soft advice someone gives when they have nothing practical to offer. It is not. It is a precise description of the mechanism that separates people who build durable wealth from people who stay busy and broke. The mechanism has a name. Fear is that name, not fear of failure, not fear of judgment, not even fear of loss in the dramatic sense. Just fear, the ordinary, ambient, background hum of it that most people have confused with being responsible. That confusion is costing you more than any bad investment ever could. Fear does not warn you. Fear narrows you. And a narrowed instrument cannot detect the frequency of opportunity, no matter how loud it plays. The previous chapter ended with a question about how wide your instrument is set. This chapter answers what shrinks it. Here is something worth sitting with before we go further. Think about a decision you made in the last 2 years that you later regretted, not because the outcome was bad, but because you can see now that you were not thinking clearly when you made it. Hold that memory for just a moment. Not to punish yourself, just to notice, what was the emotional weather around that decision? Chances are, if you are honest, there was pressure, there was urgency. There was a low-grade alarm running in the background that you called practicality or caution or just being realistic. That alarm was fear, and it was taxing every thought you had. This is the open loop you should carry through this chapter. Why do intelligent, capable people consistently make smaller decisions than they are capable of? Why does the ceiling seem to lower itself the moment the stakes feel real? The answer is not a mindset problem. It is a mechanical one. The brain, under fear, does something specific and measurable. Stress hormones flood the prefrontal cortex, the part of you that connects dots, sees patterns, holds 2 time horizons simultaneously, and generates creative options. That flood does not stop you from functioning. It just downgrades the quality of the function. You can still think. You just think with a narrower aperture. The field of what seems possible shrinks, and it shrinks quietly. That is the dangerous part. You do not feel less capable. You feel appropriately cautious. You feel like you are finally being honest about what is realistic, but realistic has been redefined by a chemical state, not by actual reality. Now hear the loop clearly. This is the part most people never see laid out as a sequence. You feel financial pressure. That pressure triggers a fear response. The fear response narrows your perception. With narrowed perception, you see fewer options. Fewer options create more pressure. More pressure amplifies the fear. The fear narrows you further. And the loop runs. Every cycle of that loop does 2 things simultaneously. It reduces the quality of the decision you are about to make, and it trains your nervous system to operate from that contracted state as a default. That training is the compound interest nobody warned you about, not the good kind, the kind that works against you. Fear is not a motivator. It is a consciousness tax, and it charges compound interest on every decision made inside it. This is worth slowing down for. A tax is something that takes a percentage of your resources before you get to use them. Fear does exactly this to your cognitive capacity. Every time you make a financial decision from inside a fear state, a reactive negotiation, an impulsive purchase to relieve anxiety, a refusal of an offer because you are too stressed to evaluate it clearly. You are paying that tax. And because the contracted state becomes habitual over time, the tax does not just apply to one decision. It applies to every decision made while that state is running, day after day, year after year. That is the compounding, not dramatic, not loud, just steady erosion of the width of your instrument. Meet a man named Dario. He worked in commercial insurance, was good at his job, made a decent salary, and had been telling himself for 4 years that he was about to make a move. His actual financial position never changed. When you sat with Dario and asked him to walk you through a typical week of financial thinking, something emerged. Every morning he checked his account balance. Not to plan, to check. The check was a fear scan, not a strategy session. If the number felt low, his whole day narrowed. He became reactive at work. He said yes to tasks that did not serve him because he needed to feel useful. He declined conversations about new opportunities because they felt risky when his account felt tight. If the number felt acceptable, he relaxed, but only until the next morning's scan. His entire operating mode was governed by a daily emotional reading of a single data point, and that data point was almost always tinged with worry. Dario was not lazy. He was not unintelligent. He was running the fear contraction loop on a 24-hour cycle, and he had been doing it so long he had no memory of operating any other way. What Dario could not see, what the loop specifically prevented him from seeing, was that the same 4-year period had held 3 distinct moments when his exact skill set was in unusual demand. He had access to all 3. He simply could not perceive them from inside the contracted state. A contracted state does not scan for opportunity. It scans for threat. The instrument was pointed in the wrong direction, and fear was holding it there. Here is the piece that matters for you. The external asset illusion tells you that Dario's problem was a lack of money, a lack of skill, maybe a lack of the right connections. The illusion insists that what you need is more of the measurable things. But Dario had the skills. He had the connections. What he lacked was width. He lacked the expanded perceptual state that could have recognized those 3 moments as entries rather than risks. And that perceptual state, that width, is not given to you by money. It is not granted by credentials or contacts. It is a function of the consciousness you are operating from at the moment the opportunity appears. This is why consciousness is the only asset that cannot be taxed. Not by a government, not by a market crash, not by inflation, but fear can tax it from the inside. And unlike external taxes, you do not receive a notice. You do not see the deduction. The theft is silent, ongoing, and compounding. Now close the loop. You asked earlier why intelligent people consistently make smaller decisions than they are capable of. Here is the answer. Intelligence without perceptual width is like a powerful engine inside a vehicle with the emergency brake engaged. The engine runs. The vehicle moves, but nowhere near the speed it was built for, and the brake wears down the machinery over time. Fear is that brake, not your circumstances, not your starting point, not the economy. The contraction is the brake, and you have been driving with it on. There is a particular version of this worth naming because it is so common in your age group, people in their mid-20s to mid-30s who feel behind. The feeling of being behind is one of the most potent fear generators available. It is also almost entirely constructed. Behind relative to what? Behind relative to a timeline you absorbed from social comparison, from parents, from an era of financial conditions that no longer exist. That feeling of lateness creates urgency. And urgency is one of fear's favorite masks. Urgency feels like motivation. It feels like fuel. But urgency that comes from fear does not expand your options. It collapses them to the one or two that seem immediately available, immediately safe, or immediately soothing. Here is the practical architecture of what this costs. When you make decisions from urgency, you accept worse terms. You negotiate less effectively because you need the outcome too much to hold the space. You avoid the slightly more demanding opportunity because your nervous system reads demand as danger. You stay in situations longer than you should, jobs, relationships, financial arrangements, because leaving requires the kind of clear, wide-aperture thinking that the contracted state cannot generate. And then one day you look up and realize that the last several years of decisions were made not by you at your best, but by the version of you who was afraid. That recognition is not a reason for regret. It is the first data point in a different investment strategy. A little later, we arrive at an argument about motivation that cuts across the standard story. Once that lands, it starts changing how you pursue every goal you have written down. But for now, here is what matters. The fear contraction loop is mechanical, not moral. You are not weak for running it. You were handed the loop by a culture that mistakes anxiety for ambition and calls perpetual vigilance drive. The loop runs in almost everyone. The difference between someone building an invisible portfolio of compounding consciousness and someone staying reactive is not that one person has no fear. It is that one person has learned to notice the moment the aperture starts to close, and they have practiced the deliberate act of widening it before the decision gets made. Noticing is not passive. It is the first active investment in the only asset that compounds forever. The instrument wide or narrow, that is not a description of your talent. It is a report on your current operating state. And operating states, unlike talent, can be changed in minutes. Fear charges compound interest on every decision made inside it. The question is how long you are willing to keep paying. Chapter 6. Meditation is not relaxation, it is capital accumulation. Something is draining out of you right now. Not dramatically. Not in a way that shows up on a bank statement. It is draining from the one place you have never thought to audit. Every hour you spend operating at a fraction of your perceptual capacity is an hour of compounding return you will never recover. The thoughts you are not thinking clearly. The connections you are not making. The decisions landing slightly crooked because the instrument making them has never been properly calibrated. This is not a soft loss. It is a measurable one, and it is accumulating interest in reverse, quietly, daily, invisibly eating the returns your consciousness could have been generating all along. The mechanism causing this loss has a name. It is not stress. It is not busyness. It is not bad luck. It is an uninvested mind. This chapter is going to show you exactly what that investment looks like, what it costs, what it returns, and why the people who figured this out decades ago are not the calmest people in the room. They are the wealthiest thinkers in it. The previous chapter closed with a question about fear. How long you are willing to keep paying its compound interest. That question was not rhetorical. It was an opening. Fear does not dissolve on its own. It does not shrink simply because you want it to, or because your circumstances improve, or because you read something encouraging. Fear diminishes when the structure of your mind changes, when the architecture itself becomes different. That is what this chapter is actually about. Not a practice, an investment. Here is the open loop you will carry for the next few minutes. A research team at Harvard found something inside the brains of ordinary people that they were not expecting to find. It contradicted a belief that most of neuroscience had held for decades. The implications reach far beyond medicine and into every financial and professional decision you will make for the rest of your life. Hold that. The answer comes before this chapter ends. Most people hear the word meditation and picture something decorative. A candle, a cushion, a person who has removed themselves from ambition. You may have tried it once and found it uneventful. You may have dismissed it as something for people who do not have real problems or real schedules or real pressure to perform. That response is understandable. It is also one of the most expensive cognitive errors a person in your position can make. Consider what you actually do when you sit down to invest money. You take a resource and place it somewhere with structural growth potential. You leave it alone long enough for compounding to do its work. Over time, that resource returns more than you put in. It grows denser. It connects to other resources. It earns on its own while you sleep. Now consider what 8 weeks of daily meditation does to the prefrontal cortex. Researchers at Harvard, led by Sarah Lazar and her team, measured the cortical thickness of long-term meditators. They found it was measurably greater than in non-meditators of the same age. Greater density in the regions responsible for attention, decision-making, and the regulation of reactive emotion. They were looking at brains that had been trained the same way muscle is trained, and they were finding tissue that was structurally thicker, more robust, more capable. That is not stress relief. That is capital accumulation. Think about what density means in financial terms. Density is not decoration. It is the difference between a balance sheet that wobbles and one that holds. When you build denser prefrontal tissue, you are building the part of your brain that decides whether to spend impulsively or invest deliberately. You are building the part that holds a difficult conversation without catastrophizing. You are building the structure that can sit inside uncertainty without collapsing into the nearest available fear response. Every time you have made a financial decision from anxiety, every time you have undersold yourself, every time you have walked away from a negotiation early because the tension felt unbearable, those moments lived in a prefrontal cortex that was not yet dense enough to hold the pressure. Density is capital. This is not a metaphor stretched for effect. It is a direct description of function. The same research program produced a second finding. The meditating brains showed stronger connectivity between regions that do not typically communicate efficiently. Regions responsible for self-awareness, long-range planning, and the integration of past experience into present decisions. Stronger connectivity, more pathways, more routes for information to travel, for patterns to be recognized, for insight to reach you before the moment has passed. What does a financial portfolio do when it is well built? It diversifies. It creates multiple exposure points so that no single failure can collapse the whole structure. What does a well-connected brain do? Exactly that. It roots around damage. It finds solutions through channels that a less connected mind simply does not have available. Connectivity is diversification, and you can build it with the same discipline you would apply to any other long-term investment strategy. Here is what this costs: 20 minutes. Daily. That is the input that produces the structural changes the Harvard studies documented. Not 90 minutes, not a silent retreat, not a life reorganized around a practice. 20 minutes, given consistently over 8 weeks, begins to measurably alter the physical structure of the organ making every decision in your life. You would not hesitate to invest 20 minutes daily in a financial vehicle that guaranteed structural returns after 8 weeks. You would not call that optional. You would not skip it because you were tired. You would treat it as a non-negotiable line item because that is what compounding assets require. Consistency. Not intensity. Consistency. Look back at your ordinary days from 3 years back before hindsight edits it. The quality of decisions you were making then. The way problems that seem manageable now used to feel genuinely immovable. Something changed. Something in the way you process, the way you hold pressure, the way you see options where before you saw walls. Now imagine if you had deliberately invested in that change. If you had treated that shift not as something that happened to you passively over time by accident, but as something you had been building with precision, with daily deposits, the way a portfolio is built. Where would the line on that graph be now? That is the cost of an uninvested mind, not what you lost, what you did not build. Now here is the open loop closing. The belief that neuroscience held for decades, the one the Harvard research contradicted, was this, that the adult brain does not change. That after a certain age, the structure you had was the structure you were keeping. Fixed, finished, the hardware locked, and the only variable left was the software running on it. What the meditation studies proved, alongside a broader field of research into neuroplasticity, was that this is simply wrong. The adult brain changes continuously. It changes in response to what you do with it. It thickens where you train it. It connects where you direct it. It atrophies where you neglect it. This matters more than almost anything else in this book. The external asset illusion, the belief that money, skills, and credentials are the primary wealth-building levers, rests entirely on the assumption that you are a fixed instrument, that your capacity to earn, decide, perceive, and execute is stable, that you are a constant in your own equation. The Harvard data says otherwise. You are a variable, and variables respond to investment. Marcus was 31. He managed a small logistics company, the kind of work that required him to hold 15 decisions in mind simultaneously, to stay clear under time pressure, and to read people accurately in fast-moving negotiations. He was good at his job, but he was slow in a very specific way. Not slow to act, slow to see. A supplier would be misleading him, and he would not catch it until 2 days later in the shower when the pieces finally assembled. A colleague would shift position in a meeting and he would miss the signal, responding to what was said instead of what was meant. He was operating on a slight delay between reality and his perception of it. A friend, without framing it as anything significant, suggested he try a daily sitting practice. Not for peace, just as an experiment. Marcus was skeptical enough to be disciplined about it. He wanted to test it fairly before dismissing it. 6 weeks in, something changed in negotiations. He was not calmer exactly. He was faster, not in action but in perception. He began catching the things he used to miss, not because he had learned new information, but because the instrument processing the information had become more precise. He eventually traced the shift to what he was doing each morning. Not because it felt spiritual, but because no other variable in his life had changed. His edge in business was not a strategy or a contact or a credential. It was 20 minutes in a chair daily compounding. The invisible portfolio is real, and meditation is one of its highest yield assets. Not because of what it feels like while you do it. Often it feels like very little, but because of what it builds inside the structure that generates every return in your life. The prefrontal density that holds hard decisions, the connectivity that finds the non-obvious solution, the regulatory capacity that keeps you out of fear-based choices that cost you for years. These are not psychological comforts. They are measurable structural properties of the only instrument you have for converting the world's raw material into something worth having. And here is the part that changes the calculation completely. Financial assets can be taxed. Skills can become obsolete. Status can dissolve overnight. But the prefrontal cortex you have built through consistent practice cannot be audited, cannot be seized, cannot depreciate in a down market, and does not require a broker. It is yours in a way that no external asset ever fully is. That is the only asset that cannot be taxed, and you have been leaving it uninvested. Further on, we arrive at an argument about willpower that cuts across the standard story. When that becomes clear, it starts changing how you allocate your mornings permanently. For now, hold this. 8 weeks is not a long time to build something that will run every financial and personal decision for the rest of your life. What would you do differently tomorrow morning if you understood that your brain is not a fixed cost, but a compounding investment? Chapter 7. Questions are consciousness's compound interest engine. Asking fewer questions is what actually makes you richer. That sounds like advice to be incurious, to settle, to stop bothering with the difficult interior work. It is not. It is a precise observation about how people who accumulate wealth at unusual rates think differently than people who ask the same familiar questions on rotation. They do not ask less. They ask deeper, wider, and stranger. Then they do something almost no one does. They refuse to answer too quickly. The quality of your financial life is not shaped by the answers you have collected. It is shaped by the size of the questions you are willing to carry without demanding that they resolve on a comfortable schedule. That may sound abstract right now. It will not by the time this chapter closes. Here, the mechanics of how a single well-chosen question compounds across 30 days will become something you can see, measure, and use. That question at the end of the last chapter was not rhetorical. What would you do differently tomorrow morning if you understood that your brain is not a fixed cost, but a compounding investment? Hold that for a moment. You do not have to answer it yet. In fact, you should resist the urge to answer it quickly. This chapter is going to explain precisely why that resistance is one of the most valuable financial habits you can develop. There is a concept in traditional portfolio management called asset quality. 2 portfolios can have the same numerical value on the same day and perform completely differently over a decade. The underlying assets compound at different rates. $1 held in a depreciating vehicle loses purchasing power. $1 held in a compounding vehicle multiplies. Most people understand this intuitively when it comes to money. Almost no one applies it to questions. Questions compound. A low-quality question asked on repeat returns a low-quality answer. That answer closes the loop. The loop closes and nothing new enters the system. A high-quality question held open continues generating new connections, new pattern recognition, new perception of opportunity for days, weeks, sometimes years. The question does not sit idle while you are asleep. Your brain continues processing it below the surface, scanning your environment for relevant data, firing associative links you were not consciously pursuing. This is not mystical. Neuroscience has a name for this background computation: diffuse processing. It is the same mechanism that brings a solution into your awareness at 7 in the morning when you were not even thinking about the problem. Here is what that means for your invisible portfolio. Every question you carry is an active position. Every question you close prematurely by accepting a convenient answer is a position you liquidated before maturity. Return to your ordinary days from 3 years back before hindsight edits it. not just financially, but in terms of what you believed was possible for you. Think about the ceiling you had placed on what you were allowed to want, what you were allowed to imagine, what you were willing to investigate. Now ask yourself, what questions were you refusing to hold back then? What were you too afraid, too busy, or too practical to sit with? How different might those 3 years have been if those questions had been running quietly in the background the entire time? That is the mirror. Look at it directly. The gap between who you were and who you could have been during those 3 years is, in large part, a question gap. Now here is the open loop this chapter is going to carry for a while. There is a specific type of question that most people avoid, not because they lack intelligence, but because the question is structurally uncomfortable. It does not have a clean answer. It invites uncertainty. It makes you feel less certain about things you had already decided. That discomfort is precisely the signal that the question is doing high-quality work on your invisible portfolio. You will understand exactly why before this chapter ends. Carla was a logistics coordinator in her early 30s, earning a salary that put her firmly in the middle of the range for her field. She was competent and well-regarded. She had read 3 or 4 books on personal finance, understood compound interest, had a modest retirement account, and felt vaguely stuck in a way she could not name. She described it once to a colleague as doing everything right and going nowhere. Her questions, and she was someone who asked questions regularly, were questions like, how do I get promoted? How do I negotiate a better salary? How do I make my money work harder? Good questions. Practical questions. Questions that fit neatly inside the life she already had. Then one evening she sat with a different kind of question. Not how do I get more out of this system, but what system am I not seeing yet? She did not answer it. She wrote it on a piece of paper and put it on her desk, and she left it open for 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, she noticed things she had walked past for 2 years. A pattern in how her company's vendors communicated. A gap in how a particular process was tracked. A recurring cost that seemed to exist because no one had asked why it existed. She did not set out to find these things. The question was running in the background, and her perception had quietly reorganized itself around it. 8 months later, she was running a small consulting operation on evenings and weekends, solving the exact problem the question had surfaced. Within 18 months, that income had replaced her base salary. Carla did not read a new book. She did not develop a new skill. She held a new question. The compound interest analogy holds precisely here. The question was the principle. Time held open was the compounding period. Her reorganized perception was the return. Now you may be asking which questions. That is exactly the right thing to ask. Not all uncomfortable questions are high-quality questions. Some discomfort is just noise. The high-leverage questions share a specific structure. They point at a system, not at a symptom. They ask about invisibility. What am I not seeing? They challenge the frame rather than operating inside it. They hold more than one variable open at once instead of isolating a single factor. And they are personal enough to actually engage your attention without being so personal that they collapse into anxiety. Here are 5 questions built to those specifications. These are not prompts for journaling, though writing is one way to work with them. They are positions to open in your invisible portfolio and hold for 30 days without forcing resolution. The first, what decision am I delaying because I believe more information will eventually make it obvious? And is that belief a genuine requirement or a form of stalling? The second, where in my financial life am I optimizing the return on a strategy that was chosen by a younger, less informed version of me? And have I ever actually re-examined whether the strategy itself is still correct? The third, what would I be doing with my time and attention if I were already at the financial level I claim to want? And why am I not doing any of that now? The fourth, what do I assume about how money moves in my industry or field that I have never personally verified? And where did that assumption come from? The fifth, what is the most expensive belief I am currently holding, meaning the belief whose price I pay not in dollars, but in constrained perception and closed options? Do not answer them now. Do not even evaluate whether they seem useful. That evaluation is the enemy of compounding. Open positions require patience, not constant review. A question assessed too early is a question answered too cheaply. Soon, we arrive at an argument about the relationship between certainty and financial progress that cuts across the standard story. After that clicks, it starts changing how you make decisions under pressure. For now, understand this. The questions listed above are not inspirational prompts. They are diagnostic instruments. Each one is designed to point at a specific class of invisible asset that most people in your situation have left uninventoried. The first surfaces the cost of decision paralysis. The second surfaces strategy drift, the slow leak of compounding that happens when the vehicle is outdated, but the fuel keeps going in. The third surfaces the behavioral contradiction between stated goals and current behavior. The fourth surfaces inherited assumption, which is one of the most common and least examined financial constraints you carry. The fifth surfaces belief-based opportunity cost, which is the one that tends to have the largest number attached to it when people finally run the calculation. 30 days, 5 questions, no forced answers. Here is the discipline required. Once a day, read all 5. Do not try to solve them. Read them the way you might read the weather report for a trip that is still weeks away, with attention but without urgency. Let your brain know the questions are active. Let diffuse processing run. And notice, without forcing significance, what surfaces in the days that follow. A conversation you overhear, a paragraph in an article, a moment at work where something previously invisible suddenly has a visible shape. That noticing is your return. That is the compounding function at work. Your invisible portfolio grows every time a question expands your field of perception. It contracts every time you close a question before it has returned its full value. Most people manage this portfolio entirely by accident, asking questions reactively, closing them impatiently, then wondering why the same year keeps repeating with slightly different scenery. You are not most people, or rather, you do not have to be. Now back to that structurally uncomfortable question, the kind most people avoid not from lack of intelligence, but from the specific discomfort of not knowing. The reason that discomfort is valuable is exactly this. The feeling of not knowing is the feeling of an open position. Certainty is a closed position. Certainty stops compounding. Not knowing, held with patience rather than anxiety, is the condition in which perception reorganizes, in which new categories become visible, in which the financial reality you currently inhabit becomes one possibility among several, rather than the only available fact. The only asset that cannot be taxed is the one inside you, the invisible portfolio of perceptions, questions, and expanding awareness that you carry from moment to moment, room to room, decision to decision. No government can assess it. No market correction can have it. No recession can freeze it. And unlike every other asset you will ever hold, its value is determined entirely by the quality of questions you choose to carry. The size of your financial life is the size of the questions you are willing to hold. What question have you been afraid to carry? Chapter 8. Discomfort is consciousness expanding its borders. Something is being taken off your side of the table while you keep moving, not loudly, not through some dramatic loss you could point to and name. It is being taken quietly in the ordinary moments when you feel the pull toward something bigger and then stop. When the edge of something new appears and your body tightens and you retreat to the familiar. Every one of those retreats has a cost, not just the thing you did not do, the capacity you did not build, the version of you that did not get to exist. And the cost is not flat, it compounds. Each retreat makes the next one slightly easier. Each time you turn away from the uncomfortable edge, the distance grows just a little wider, just a little more invisible. Until one day the edge itself is gone from your view entirely. You never saw it leave. That is the mechanism. That is what no one tells you about discomfort. Avoiding it is not neutral. Avoiding it is the slowest and most invisible form of loss you will ever experience. But this chapter is not about the avoiding. It is about what happens when you stop. That question from the last chapter is still with you. What question have you been afraid to carry? You do not need to answer it yet. But notice what happened in your body when you first heard it. Notice if something tightened or shifted or briefly wanted to change the subject. That physical response is the thing we need to talk about first. Here is what that feeling actually is. Most people have been taught to read discomfort as a signal to stop. The tightness in the chest, the resistance that rises when you are standing at the edge of something unfamiliar. The voice that arrives right on cue, listing every reason the timing is wrong, every reason you are not ready, every reason someone else would be better suited for whatever this is. You have been taught to call that feeling fear or doubt or a sign that you are not prepared. But you were taught wrong, not maliciously, just incorrectly. In Chapter 5, we looked at what fear does to consciousness, the way it narrows, the way it pulls every resource inward, like a city dimming its lights during a blackout, conserving what little it has. Fear contracts. It is a closing, a tightening, a reduction of the available field. You become smaller in fear, not weaker necessarily, but more concentrated, more defended, more enclosed. Discomfort is the precise opposite of that. Discomfort is what expansion feels like from the inside. Think about that for a moment. When something genuinely expands, it presses against its current boundary, a muscle under load, lungs filling past their habitual depth, a mind encountering a concept that does not fit inside the framework it currently holds. Expansion is not comfortable. It was never supposed to be. The pressure is not a warning. The pressure is the process. And every time you have mistaken the sensation of expansion for a reason to retreat, you have misread the single most important signal your consciousness ever sends you. This is the open question this chapter is built around. Hold it for a while before we close it. If discomfort is the sensation of growth, then what would your last 6 months have looked like if you had stayed in the discomfort instead of leaving it? Do not answer yet. Just let the question sit. A man named Dario spent 11 years working in logistics. He was good at it. He was reliable, precise, and the work came easily to him, which is exactly why he stayed. Every few years, a new possibility would surface. A business idea he had sketched in a notebook, an opportunity to move into a different role, a course that would cost him 8 weeks of evenings and one significant stretch of discomfort. And every time something happened, not a crisis, not a catastrophe, just a familiar tightening in his chest that he had learned over years to call common sense. He would feel the resistance and translate it as, "This is not for you. This is not the right time. Wait until things settle." And he waited. For 11 years, he waited for things to settle. What he did not understand was that the tightening was not a door closing. It was a door opening. He had been using a signal of readiness as a reason for delay. And each delay made the next one feel more justified, because the gap between who he was and who he might have become kept quietly widening. By the time he understood this, he was not broken. He was not behind in any permanent way. But he had spent 11 years depositing nothing into the only portfolio that cannot be taxed, audited, seized, or lost in a market correction. He had left his consciousness portfolio untouched, and an untouched portfolio earns nothing. Dario is not a cautionary tale about wasted years. He is a description of what it feels like to be human before this knowledge arrives. And the knowledge is simple, brutal in its simplicity, actually. The discomfort you feel at the edge of something new is a consciousness dividend being deposited. The pain is the asset arriving, not arriving later, not arriving as a reward after you have pushed through, arriving in the moment of the push itself. The expansion is happening at the exact instant you feel like stopping. The compound is accruing in the tightness, in the resistance, in the held breath before the thing you almost did not do. This is why the invisible portfolio grows differently from every other kind of wealth. Money compounds on a schedule. You can calculate it. You can see it in a spreadsheet or a balance statement. But consciousness compounds in moments of friction, and those moments do not arrive on a predictable schedule. They arrive disguised as inconvenient, uncomfortable, poorly timed, emotionally loaded requests from life. They arrive as the conversation you do not want to have, the project you do not feel ready for, the question you are afraid to carry. Every time you engage with them, something deposits. Every time you walk toward the edge instead of away from it, the portfolio grows in a way no external audit will ever capture and no external force will ever reduce. Picture your ordinary days from 3 years back before hindsight edits it, not in broad strokes, specifically. What was the largest thing that scared you then? What was the edge you were standing at, the thing that felt too big or too soon or too much? Now ask yourself, what would have been different if you had stepped into it? Not your income, not your status, not your resume, your capacity, your range, the size of the field inside which you can operate without flinching. That is the mirror. That is the question this chapter asks you to sit with fully and honestly before you move on. Because capacity is what actually determines what you can do with everything else you acquire. A person with high financial literacy and low psychological range will always find a ceiling. They will earn more and feel more exposed. They will build more and feel less safe. The external accumulation outpaces the internal one, and at some point the gap creates its own kind of crisis. But a person who has been consistently depositing into the invisible portfolio is different. Someone who has trained themselves to stay in friction instead of fleeing it, who has learned to read discomfort as information rather than instruction. That person has no ceiling that is not also an invitation. Later on, we arrive at an argument about the relationship between confidence and action that cuts across the standard story. Once you grasp that turn, it starts changing the order in which you make decisions. For now, stay here. Stay with the mechanics of what happens inside you when expansion is occurring, because understanding the mechanics is what makes it navigable. If you know that the tightening in your chest is not warning you away but signaling arrival, you can make a different choice. Not an easier one, a different one. There is a distinction worth holding. Growth does not become comfortable once you understand it. It becomes legible. You can read the sensation correctly. You can say, I know what this is. This is the border of my current consciousness pressing against something larger than it has held before. This is the moment of deposit, and then you can decide with full awareness to stay or to go. Most of the time, once you name it correctly, you stay, because the fear of the unknown is mostly the fear of misidentification. You thought the signal meant danger. Now you know it means growth. And growth, for a person who has decided to treat their consciousness as their primary compounding asset, is never something to walk away from. Close the question now. What would your last 6 months have looked like if you had stayed in the discomfort instead of leaving it? You already know the answer. You felt it when the question first landed. The answer is larger, more capable, further along the compounding curve of the only asset that cannot be taken from you in a lawsuit, a market crash, or a year that goes sideways in ways you never predicted. The loss was real, but it was never permanent. Every moment you are standing at a new edge is the beginning of a new deposit. Discomfort is not the price of growth. Discomfort is growth, arriving in the only form it has ever known. So stay. What you are feeling right now is not a reason to stop. It is proof that something is being built. Chapter 9. Your peer group is your consciousness portfolio manager. Spending time with people who think smaller than you does not just slow you down. It actively reduces your returns. That sounds like arrogance. It sounds like the kind of thing someone says right before they justify cutting off everyone who ever believed in them. It is not. It is a precise description of how consciousness behaves when it is treated like a passive asset instead of a managed one. The uncomfortable part is this. This management happens automatically, whether you consent to it or not. Your inner circle is already running your portfolio. The only question is whether they are any good at it. Something was built in that last chapter. You felt it. That discomfort, that resistance, that strange heat of deciding to stay when everything in you wanted to retreat, that was not weakness breaking down. That was foundation going in. Now we are going to talk about what you build on top of that foundation. More importantly, we are going to talk about who you allow into the construction site. Here is the open question this chapter will ask and not answer immediately. If you already know, intellectually, that your consciousness is your most valuable compounding asset, why does being around certain people for just a few hours seem to drain every dollar of that asset by the time you walk out the door? Hold that. We will come back to it. First, you need to understand something about mirror neurons. You have heard of them. Most people have at this point. But the way they are usually described makes them sound like a nice feature, a biological capacity for empathy, a mechanism of human connection. That framing is incomplete. Mirror neurons are not just empathy hardware. They are your brain's most efficient data port. When you sit across from another person, your brain does not observe their state and then decide whether to adopt it. Your brain begins simulating their state involuntarily, almost instantly, before your conscious mind has finished its coffee. You do not choose to absorb the energy of the room. You are already absorbing it. The only variable is how much awareness you bring to that process. Now apply that to money. Apply it to the slow, compounding growth of your consciousness as a wealth-building mechanism. Every week you sit in sustained proximity to people who believe that financial struggle is just the natural condition of people like them. Your brain is running that simulation, not because you are weak, not because you have failed to want better badly enough, because that is what brains do. They simulate proximity. They rehearse whatever they are shown most consistently. Revisit your ordinary days from 3 years back before hindsight edits it, not geographically, internally. What did you believe was possible for someone like you? What ceiling did you think was realistic? Not because anyone told you directly, but because everyone around you seemed to stop at that exact same height. That ceiling was not yours. It was borrowed. You inherited it the way you inherit an accent, through prolonged, unconscious exposure to a consistent signal. This is the portfolio management problem, and it is precise. Imagine you hired a financial advisor and gave them complete discretion over your investments. You never reviewed the statements. You never questioned the strategy. You just assumed, because they were present and because you trusted them somewhat, that they were doing something useful with your money. Years later, you discover they had been keeping most of your portfolio in instruments that capped returns at 4%, not out of malice. Because that was what they personally believed was safe, sensible, and realistic. You would be furious. You would not say, well, I should have wanted more returns harder. You would say, the person managing my money had a limited belief about what was possible, and I let that limit compound over time. Your peer group is that advisor. Let me introduce you to a woman named Claudette. She was 29, working in logistics coordination, smart, observant, the kind of person who reads the right books and takes the right notes. Then, on Sundays, she went to brunch with the same 5 friends she had known since college. Those friends were good people, generous, loyal, funny. They also talked about money the way people talk about the weather, as something that happened to you, something outside your control, something that was either good or bad depending on factors no one could really influence. Every Sunday, Claudette downloaded several hours of that signal directly into the part of her brain that makes decisions. By Monday morning, whatever she had read, whatever she had decided, whatever new commitment she had made to herself on Saturday, had been quietly diluted. Not erased, diluted. And diluted returns, compounded over years, are the financial definition of falling behind while standing still. Claudette did not leave those friends. That is not the story. What she did was add. She found 2 people who were 3 years ahead of where she wanted to be, not in wealth specifically, but in the quality of their thinking about wealth. She started having deliberate, even slightly uncomfortable conversations with those 2 people once a week. She stayed loyal to her old circle, but she rebalanced her portfolio. Within 18 months, the ceiling she had inherited had been replaced by a much higher assumption, built from sustained exposure to evidence that the ceiling was arbitrary. The principle is not addition by subtraction. It is reallocation by intention. Here is the part most books skip. Most self-help conversations about peer groups frame this as an identity threat. They say things like, you need to outgrow certain people. That framing creates guilt, or defensiveness, or a kind of cold pragmatism that turns relationships into transactions. None of that is useful. The portfolio framing is cleaner and more honest. You are not abandoning anyone. You are managing exposure the way any rational investor manages concentration risk. If 80% of your portfolio is in one sector that historically returns below inflation, you do not hate that sector. You diversify. Your consciousness portfolio needs diversification across consciousness levels. That is the precise truth. Now, back to the question that was left open. Why does spending a few hours with certain people seem to drain the compound you have been building? Here is the mechanism. When your consciousness is operating at a level significantly above the sustained average of your social environment, you are not just tolerating a lower signal. You are actively working against it. Your brain is simulating their state while also maintaining your own elevated one. That is a form of resistance training. Done occasionally, it is actually useful. It builds the mental muscle of holding your own state under pressure. Done constantly, without deliberate recovery, it costs more than it returns. The asset you have been growing does not disappear, but it does not compound efficiently when most of its available energy goes into holding its own ground. This is why the most financially conscious people you will ever meet are not hermits. They are deliberate about their primary sustained exposure. They have people they love who operate at different levels. They attend family dinners, they keep old friends. They do not live in sealed bubbles of curated high-performance association. But they are clear, sometimes ruthlessly clear, about who they let manage the portfolio on a daily basis. Daily is the operative word. Consciousness compounds daily. The interest posts every 24 hours and your peer environment is setting the rate. As this book keeps moving, we arrive at an argument about solitude and growth that cuts across the standard story. When that point settles, it starts changing how you decide to spend the first and last 30 minutes of your day. For now, focus on the portfolio. You need to audit it. Not with shame, and not with a spreadsheet, but with the honest eye of someone who finally decides to look at their account statements instead of assuming everything is fine. Who do you spend the most unstructured time with? What do those people believe, not say, but believe, about what is financially possible for someone like them? When you leave those interactions, are you running a slightly higher rate than when you arrived, or a slightly lower one? These are not judgments about those people. They are portfolio diagnostics. The invisible portfolio, your consciousness as an asset, is not managed by your intentions. It is managed by your inputs. What you repeatedly expose yourself to, what you rehearse through conversation, what you simulate through sustained proximity. That is the management. The compound interest formula does not care about your goals. It only tracks the rate and the time. If your rate is being capped by the average belief ceiling of your 5 closest daily inputs, no amount of reading, visualization, or solitary ambition will overcome that drag over a long enough horizon. The math is too slow in your favor and too fast against you. But here is the hope that is not false. You do not need to overhaul your entire social world. You need to introduce one new sustained input that operates at a level above your current ceiling. One mentor, even a remote one through their recorded thinking. One peer who is 3 years ahead in the specific dimension you are developing. One consistent conversation that pulls your simulation upward instead of anchoring it to a familiar but limited floor. One reallocation, held consistently over time, changes the rate. And changed rates, compounded, are the difference between where you are and where you cannot currently imagine. Claudette ended up hiring her first employee 2 years after that Sunday rebalancing. She did not do it because she became a different person. She did it because she stopped letting other people's capped expectations manage her most valuable asset without her authorization. You are now authorized to review your portfolio. The question you carry into the next chapter is this: if proximity manages your portfolio, whether you consent to it or not, what does it mean to consent, and what changes the moment you do? Chapter 10. Reading expands consciousness faster than experience alone. Every hour you are not reading a great book, something is slipping away. Not dramatically, not in a way you can feel in the moment, but quietly, the way water leaves a cracked vessel. You are losing access to centuries of refined perception that someone already paid for with their life. Their decades of struggle and discovery and revision sit inside a bound set of pages, priced at the cost of a lunch, waiting to deposit directly into your invisible portfolio, and you are walking past it. Not because you are lazy, because no one ever showed you what that transaction actually costs when you skip it. The loss compounds. 1 year of not reading deeply is not just 1 year of slower growth. It is the conversation you could not have, the decision you made with incomplete maps, the pattern you could not see because no one ever named it for you. Something is being withheld from you right now, not by a person, not by circumstance, by a gap in how you understand reading itself. That gap has a mechanism, and understanding the mechanism is where this chapter begins. Consent is the answer to the question you carried in from the last chapter. Proximity manages your consciousness portfolio, whether you agree to it or not. The people around you, the conversations you repeat, the media you consume, all of it is making deposits and withdrawals from the only asset that cannot be taxed, cannot be seized, and cannot depreciate unless you stop feeding it. Consenting to that process means choosing your inputs deliberately. And the single highest return input available to you right now is a book written by someone who spent 40 years learning something you need to know in the next 40 days. Think about that for a moment. 40 years compressed into 6 hours of reading. That is not a metaphor. That is the actual arithmetic. Here is the open question you should sit with as this chapter unfolds. Why do most people treat reading the way they treat going to the gym? Something they intend to do, something they feel good about in theory, something that rarely survives contact with Tuesday evening. The answer is not motivation. It is not discipline. It is something deeper. It lives in a misunderstanding about what reading actually is. Hold that question. It will resolve before this chapter ends. A woman named Rosario was 26 years old and working the front desk of a mid-size accounting firm in Cincinnati. She was not unhappy. She was not struggling in any dramatic way. She had a small apartment, a reliable car, and a performance review that called her a valued member of the team. But she had a feeling she described to her sister as standing still on a moving walkway. The world was advancing around her, and she was simply maintaining position. One afternoon, on a lunch break she almost skipped, she wandered into a used bookstore 2 blocks from her office. She spent $3.75 on a worn copy of a book about systems thinking. She almost put it back. The cover was ugly. The author was not famous. But something in the first page stopped her and she bought it. Over the next 3 weeks she read it twice. She started noticing patterns at work she had never seen before. The way certain problems repeated not because of bad people, but because of how the system around those people was structured. She proposed one small process change to her manager, then another. Within 8 months, she was leading a team, not because the book gave her a script, because it gave her a set of lenses she did not have before. Rosario did not transform, she expanded. That is the distinction that matters. Change implies something was wrong. Expansion implies something is being added. A great book does not fix you. It deposits a layer of consciousness that was not there before, a layer that remains, that compounds, that earns interest on everything you experience after it. Now here is the mechanism most people miss. Experience alone is a slow teacher. Brilliant, yes. Irreplaceable in some ways, absolutely, but slow. When you learn something through experience, you have to live through the confusion, the wrong turns, the cost of not knowing. You pay full price for every lesson. A great book lets you audit someone else's tuition. You get the lesson without the scar. You get the map without having to get lost first. This is consciousness leverage, and it is the fastest form of it available to you. The compound interest formula you heard earlier in this book, the one most people apply only to money, works here with equal precision. A small deposit of expanded perception, made consistently, does not grow in a straight line. It curves. What you understand at the end of a year of serious reading is not 12 times what you understood in the first month. It is geometrically greater. Every new layer of understanding changes how you process every experience that follows. You are not just adding knowledge. You are upgrading the instrument that receives knowledge. That is not a subtle distinction. That is the entire point. Call up your ordinary days from 3 years back before hindsight edits it. Not just financially, think about how you thought. Think about the ceiling you had on what you believed was possible for you. Think about the problems that felt permanent then, that now feel like they had obvious solutions. That shift did not happen because time passed. It happened because something expanded in you. What if that expansion had been twice as fast? What would be different right now today about the options in front of you? You cannot go back and answer that question with real data, but you can answer it going forward. Here is the specific investment list. Not a vague suggestion to read more. A precise prescription for your invisible portfolio, organized by the category of consciousness each one deposits. The first category is systems perception, the ability to see the invisible structures that shape outcomes most people attribute to luck or character. For this, read Thinking in Systems by Donella Meadows. It will change the resolution at which you see almost every situation in your life. The second category is financial psychology, not tactics or tips, but the emotional and cognitive wiring that governs every money decision you make. Read The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. It is short. It is precise. It will not tell you what to invest in. It will show you who you are when money is involved, and that is far more valuable. The third category is long-range thinking, the capacity to make decisions from a position of time rather than urgency. This is one of the rarest and most profitable perceptions a person can develop. Read The Almanac of Naval Ravikant, compiled by Erik Jorgensen. It is available free online. Cost is not an excuse. The fourth category is pattern recognition in human behavior, the ability to read what is actually happening in rooms, in negotiations, in relationships, where what is said and what is meant are different things. Read Influence by Robert Cialdini. Not to manipulate, to become unmanipulable. The difference is everything. The fifth category is primary source wisdom, the direct words of someone who lived and thought at a level most modern books only describe. Read Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. It was never meant to be published. It is a private journal of a person actively working to expand their own consciousness in real time. It reads like it was written last week. 5 books, 5 categories. A total investment of perhaps $40 and 30 hours of your life. What those 30 hours deposit into your invisible portfolio will earn returns for the next 30 years. Now, back to the open question from earlier. Why do people who genuinely want to read more consistently fail to do it? The answer is not willpower. The answer is that they have framed reading as consumption, something you do to relax, or to feel productive, or to say you did it. And consumption competes with every other form of consumption in your life. It loses to the easier thing almost every time. The reframe is this: reading a great book is not consumption. It is investment. It is a transaction. You are purchasing someone else's decades of expanded perception and depositing them directly into your own portfolio. The moment you feel that, really feel the transaction happening, you stop treating reading as a leisure activity you fit in when you have time. You start protecting it the way you protect any serious investment. 1 hour with a great book deposits the consciousness, compound of decades of another person's lived expansion directly into your own portfolio. That is not an inspirational line. That is the actual economics of what is happening when you read at that level. The only asset that cannot be taxed, cannot be inflated away, and cannot be taken from you is the one that lives inside your skull in the quality of how you perceive and respond to the world. And that asset either grows or it stagnates. There is no maintenance mode. There is no holding pattern. Consciousness that is not actively expanding is slowly narrowing because the world around it is moving and it is not. Every book you read at this level is a vote for expansion. Every week you skip is not neutral. The external asset illusion tells you that your net worth is the number in your account, the skill on your resume, the title on your door. And those things are not nothing, but they are downstream of something. They are the outputs. Consciousness is the input. The quality of what you think generates the quality of what you do. The quality of what you do determines everything else that follows. You do not get ahead of this sequence by working harder at the output. You get ahead of it by upgrading the source. The reader you choose to become this year will generate a version of you, 3 years from now, who operates at a level the current version of you can barely imagine. So the question worth carrying into the next chapter is not whether reading matters. You already know it does. The real question is this: what is the one belief you are currently holding about money and wealth that was handed to you by someone who never examined it themselves? And what happens to your trajectory the moment you replace it with something you chose on purpose? Chapter 11. Silence is the highest yield investment most people avoid. Silence does not restore you, it builds you. That sounds like soft, retreat-like advice from someone who has given up on practical strategy. It is not. It describes a specific biological and psychological mechanism, one that determines whether the wisdom you absorb actually settles into your nervous system, or simply passes through you like water through a cracked cup. You have been treating silence as rest. It is not rest. It is the processing phase. And without it, nothing you read, nothing you hear, nothing you choose to believe has anywhere to go. That question from the last chapter is still alive in your mind, whether you realize it or not. What is the belief about money you inherited from someone who never examined it? You may have already begun to feel the edges of an answer forming. But newly formed beliefs are fragile before they are integrated. They exist in your mind the way wet cement exists on a sidewalk, full of potential, and easily ruined by anything that walks across it too soon. This chapter is about protecting that cement. It is about the specific window of time where consciousness deposits either become permanent capital or quietly evaporate. Let that tension sit for a moment. What if you have been doing almost everything right, reading, reflecting, choosing better inputs, and still not compounding at the rate you expected? What if the missing ingredient is not more input, but the one practice almost every productive person skips entirely? Bring to mind your ordinary days from 3 years back before hindsight edits it, not the version of you with different circumstances. The version of you with a different inner landscape. 3 years ago, what did you believe was possible for someone in your situation? And 3 years from today, what do you want the interior of your mind to look like? Not your bank account, not your title. Your actual mind, the quality of thought it produces, the clarity it operates with, the speed at which it recognizes opportunity and releases fear. That interior is built in silence, and most people never build it at all. Here is the open loop worth carrying through this chapter. If consciousness is the asset that compounds, and compounding requires a settlement period, what does that settlement period actually look like in daily practice? And why does skipping it cost more than most people ever calculate? You will find the answer. But first, you need to understand the cost. Marcus ran a small manufacturing consultancy out of a shared office space in Cleveland. He was the kind of person who filled every available minute with something useful: podcasts during the commute, industry reports over lunch, business audiobooks before sleep. He genuinely believed that maximum input equaled maximum growth. His calendar was a monument to efficiency. He was always learning, always improving, always consuming. And yet, after 2 years of this, he noticed something troubling. He could reference almost anything he had studied, but he could not apply it fluidly. In client meetings under pressure, he reached for the ideas he had held for years, the ones already woven into how he thought, and left the newer, sharper frameworks sitting unused in his memory like expensive tools he had never learned to grip. He was rich in material and poor in execution. The content was in his head, but not in his hands. A mentor of his, a woman named Ruth, who had run her own firm for 26 years, watched him present one afternoon and said something that changed the shape of his work. She said, "You keep buying inventory, Marcus, but you never open the warehouse." He did not know what she meant until later that evening. For the first time in months, he sat in his car in a parking garage for 20 minutes and did absolutely nothing. No phone, no audio, no review, nothing. He did not feel productive. He felt uncomfortable, and then slowly something happened. Connections formed on their own. A conversation from Tuesday linked itself to a paragraph he had read 6 weeks earlier. A client's problem he had been circling for days suddenly had an obvious shape, not because he had studied harder, because he had finally stopped long enough for his mind to do the work it had been trying to do all along. Ruth called it opening the warehouse. You will understand it from this point forward as the settlement period. Every serious financial system has one. When you make a deposit into a brokerage account, there is a clearing period, often called T+1 or T+2, during which the transaction is processed and the funds become available capital. During that window, the money is technically yours, but you cannot move it yet. The system needs time to confirm, register, and convert the transfer into something you can actually use. Your consciousness works identically. When you absorb a new idea, truly absorb it, not just hear it, your brain does not immediately reclassify it as operational. It holds it in a provisional state. Neural pathways are being tested. Existing frameworks are being quietly rearranged to accommodate the new structure. The brain is checking whether this new information is compatible with what it already knows. If not, it does the slow work of updating the old map. This process takes time, and it cannot happen while you are consuming the next thing. Most people never stop consuming long enough to let this happen. They move from podcast to article to conversation to video to meeting to scroll, and the deposits pile up, uncleared, unused. The invisible portfolio grows in theory and shrinks in practice, because nothing is ever fully settling. You end up informed but not integrated, aware but not capable, full but somehow still hungry. 20 minutes is the number, not because of mysticism, and not because it is a round number someone chose arbitrarily. 20 minutes appears consistently in sleep architecture research as the minimum duration for the brain's default mode network to move into a deep consolidation pass. This is the network that activates when you are not actively processing external input. It is responsible for connecting disparate pieces of information, generating insight, and encoding recent learning into long-term structure. You cannot force it to run. You can only create the conditions where it is allowed to run. Silence is those conditions. Treat it like a settlement period in your consciousness brokerage account. Every morning or every evening or at whatever fixed point your day allows, 20 minutes, no input, no task, no agenda. Sit. Breathe slowly enough that your exhale is longer than your inhale. Let your mind move without directing it. You are not meditating in the traditional sense, though it borrows from meditation. You are not napping, though your body will feel the relief of one. You are running the clearing protocol on the deposits you have made since the last session. What comes up during that window is not random. Your brain will return on its own to whatever is most unresolved. It will hand you connections you did not see while you were busy. It will surface the question beneath the question. And very often, more often than feels coincidental, it will produce the one insight that unlocks a problem you have been circling for days. This is not magic. This is the brain doing what it was designed to do when you stop interrupting it. Now here is the thing about silence that makes most people avoid it. It is genuinely uncomfortable. The moment input stops, something else begins. The thoughts you have been outrunning catch up. The low-grade anxiety that productivity kept at arm's length shows up, uninvited and loud. The emotional material you have been deferring arrives right on schedule. This is why silence feels like a luxury to some people and a threat to others. It removes the armor. It forces you to be present with exactly what is happening inside you, without the buffer of entertainment or task. But here is the exact inversion that changes everything. The discomfort is not a sign that silence is not working. It is a sign that it is. The thoughts that feel unbearable in the first 3 minutes of stillness are the thoughts that have been quietly draining your cognitive resources all day. They are background processes eating your bandwidth. Silence does not create them. It surfaces them, which is the first step to clearing them permanently. The person who never sits in silence is not avoiding pain. They are deferring it, compounding the interest on it, and paying it back with their best hours of focus. Silence is the only asset that cannot be taxed. You cannot regulate stillness. No economic system can claim a percentage of the clarity you build inside 20 minutes of deliberate quiet. No market downturn devalues what gets integrated during that window. The compound interest on a consciousness that regularly settles its deposits is immune to external fluctuation in a way that no financial instrument ever will be. You can lose money. You can lose status. You cannot lose what has been genuinely integrated into the structure of how you think. Marcus started blocking 20 minutes at the end of his workday. Not for journaling, not for planning. Just sitting. Within 3 weeks, he described his thinking in client meetings as feeling less like retrieval and more like access, as though the ideas were already at hand rather than being hunted for under pressure. He attributed nothing mystical to it. He said simply, "I stopped treating my mind like a storage unit and started treating it like a living system that needs oxygen." A living system that needs oxygen. That is what silence is, not the absence of productivity, the condition of it. And this is where the compound interest formula comes full circle. The first time you encountered it in this book, it was attached to money, to principal, rate, and time. You were asked to think about the rate at which your consciousness could grow. Now the full picture emerges. Principle is your capacity for awareness. Rate is the quality of input you choose. Time is consistency. But there has always been a fourth variable hiding in the formula, the one that determines whether compounding actually occurs or simply accumulates on paper without ever clearing. The fourth variable is the settlement period. Without it, you have deposits but no capital. Without it, every investment in your invisible portfolio stays liquid on paper and unusable in practice. Consciousness compounds during input, but it consolidates during silence. The consolidation window is not optional. It is not a reward for doing the other work. It is the mechanism by which the other work becomes real. Now close that loop. What does the settlement period look like in daily practice? 20 minutes, fixed time, no input, non-negotiable. That is the daily protocol. And the cost of skipping it is not visible in a single session. It is visible across months when you look back at someone who consumed everything and retained little versus someone who consumed deliberately and integrated deeply. One of them compounds, the other just collects. In a later section, we arrive at an argument about taking action that cuts across the standard story. After that really registers, it starts changing not just how much you do, but when you do it and why. But right now, tonight, this is the question worth holding as you move into the next chapter. If the highest yield investment requires nothing but time and stillness, what does it say about you that you have been too busy to make it? Chapter 12. You are now the wealthiest asset in any room. Every civilization that has ever risen and fallen left behind the same quiet mystery. Across centuries and continents, in the ruins of trading cities and in the letters of forgotten scholars, the same observation surfaces again and again. A small number of people seem to carry something into every room that changed what happened there. Not wealth, not status, something prior to both. Something that generated wealth and status the way a spring generates a river, not by chasing the river, but simply by being the source. The mystery was never what they had. The mystery was what they were. And now, standing at chapter 12 of a book that began with a compound interest formula, you are about to understand what that quality actually is. You have been quietly building it all along, without knowing the full scope of what you were doing. The last chapter ended by raising a question, and that thread is still live. If the highest yield investment requires nothing but time and stillness, what does it say about you that you have been too busy to make it? Hold that. You will need it before this chapter is finished. Here is the open loop this chapter begins with. There is a version of you that has already crossed the threshold. You do not yet know where that person stands or what they know, but the distance between you and them is not skill. It is not money. It is not even time. By the end of this chapter, you will know exactly what it is. Think back to chapter 1. The compound interest formula. You first encountered it as a financial idea, a number that grows not because you push it, but because you leave it alone long enough for the growth to feed the growth. $1,000 at 8% for 40 years does not become 9,000. It becomes 21,000. The principle barely matters by the end. What matters is the rate, the time, and the discipline not to interrupt the process. You were told then to hold that formula loosely. That it applied to something larger than money, that the real asset was not yet named. It is named now. Consciousness compounds the same way. Go back to your ordinary days from 3 years back before hindsight edits it, not financially, deeper than that. Think about what you noticed, what you missed, what made you anxious that now makes you curious, what questions you did not even know how to ask. 3 years ago, you could not have sat with this chapter the way you are sitting with it right now. The words would have been the same. The person receiving them would have been different. That difference is not an accident. It is interest, paid out in perception. Every chapter before this one was a deposit. Not information deposited into memory. That is the wrong mental model. It is why most people who consume books like this feel temporarily inspired and then return to the same patterns within a week. The deposit was not content. The deposit was contact. Each time you stayed with an idea long enough to feel it rather than file it, The rate on your consciousness portfolio ticked upward. Small increments, invisible on any single day, enormous across a year. That is the compound consciousness effect. It is the only investment with a guaranteed positive return. Unlike money, unlike skill sets, unlike professional reputation, the interest cannot be taxed, cannot be inflated away, and cannot be seized by any external circumstance. The market for your own awareness has no bare season. Now here is where the room changes. Nadia was 31 and had been a mid-level project manager at a logistics company for 4 years. She was competent. She was well-liked. She was, by every visible measure, exactly where she was supposed to be. But she kept noticing something strange in meetings. When certain people walked in, not always the most senior, not always the most polished, the room would reorient. Conversations that had been spinning would find direction. Problems that had seemed intractable would suddenly reveal a clean edge. She watched this happen with one man in particular, a senior consultant named Marcus, who said less than almost anyone in the room, and yet always seemed to leave with more than anyone else. One afternoon she asked him how he did it. He looked at her with an expression she could not immediately read and said, "I stopped trying to get something out of the meeting. I started trying to see the meeting clearly." She thought he was being modest. He was not being modest. He was describing a practice he had cultivated for 9 years. He had learned to walk into a room carrying a quality of attention so precise and so unhurried that the room itself became more legible to him than it was to anyone else present. He was not smarter, he was more conscious. And in a room full of people performing, that quality was the scarcest resource in the building. Nadia thought about that for 3 weeks. Then she started practicing. Scarcity is the engine of value. That has not changed since the first traders swapped goods along ancient roads. What changes is which resources are scarce in a given era. Right now, the most abundant things on earth are information, distraction, and noise. They are so abundant they have become almost worthless. What is scarce, genuinely, dangerously scarce, is the capacity to be fully present with one clear question, to hold a problem without rushing to the comfort of an answer, to sit in a room and see it more accurately than the people performing in it. That is you. That is what you have been building. Every room you walk into now carries a different calculus. You are not the person looking for opportunities. You are the person whose presence creates them. That is not a claim about arrogance or superiority. It is a claim about function. An instrument that has been tuned generates music. An instrument that has been neglected generates noise. 11 chapters of tuning now sit inside your nervous system. The question is not whether you are ready. The question is whether you believe the tuning is real. And here is the answer to the loop that opened this chapter. The version of you that has already crossed the threshold is not ahead of you in time. That person is not some future self waiting on the other side of a decision you have not made yet. That person is the one who is listening right now and understanding, not just intellectually, but somewhere steadier than thought, that the primary asset has never been external, not the stock portfolio, not the professional credential, not the network of names. Those are the outputs. Consciousness is the input. And the compound interest on an input does not produce more input. It produces a different quality of reality. This is the wealth formula that does not appear in any financial textbook. It will not be in one for a long time because it cannot be measured in quarters, but you can measure it yourself. You just did it a few minutes ago when I asked you to think back 3 years. That measurement you just ran, that is the only financial statement that truly matters. The invisible portfolio, growing without announcement, compounding without fanfare, requiring only that you not interrupt it. The room you walk into tomorrow is already different because of what you are carrying into it. You are not chasing wealth anymore. You are the instrument that generates it. So the only question left is this: what will you do with a room once you realize you are the most valuable thing in it? Chapter 13. The invisible portfolio is now paying dividends. You have done the work. Something in you knows that. Not the loud, celebratory kind of knowing, the quiet kind, the kind that sits in the chest rather than the mouth. And yet you are still watching the outside of your life for proof. You keep checking the account balance, the title, the number of people who call you back. You are looking at the wrong screen. The returns you have earned are already compiling. They are not showing up where you have been trained to look. That is the gap between where you are and what you already are. The question this chapter will answer is not whether the investment has been working. The question is whether you will recognize the dividends when they arrive subtly, practically, without fanfare, and right on time. Here is the open loop worth holding. What does it actually feel like when consciousness is paying you back? Not in metaphor. In your Monday morning, in a specific conversation you almost did not have, in a decision you made last week that you could not have made 2 years ago. That question is what this entire chapter is about. Sit with that. The last chapter closed by asking what you will do with a room once you realize you are the most valuable thing in it. That question was not rhetorical. It was pointing at something precise. The moment when your internal sense of value stops depending on external validation. And once that moment arrives, what follows is not a dramatic reinvention. What follows is a series of small, almost invisible dividends. They accumulate with the same logic that made compound interest the most powerful force in any financial portfolio. Remember your ordinary days from 3 years back before hindsight edits it. The problems you brought into rooms. The decisions you made from fear rather than clarity. The options you could not see because your thinking stopped at a certain edge. 3 years of consciousness investment looks quiet from the outside. From the inside, it looks enormous. That gap is the dividend. That distance is the return. Now here is something specific. The first dividend you will notice is better questions. Not more questions, better ones. You will find yourself mid-conversation and realize you just asked something that cut directly to the center of what actually mattered. You will notice the other person pause. No one had asked them that before. That pause is a return on investment. It will not show up in your bank account, but it will open a door that a lesser question would have walked past. The second dividend is what you stop tolerating. Quietly, without drama, certain situations will simply stop fitting. A job that was acceptable becomes obviously wrong. A relationship that was comfortable becomes obviously costly. You will not rage against these things. You will simply notice that they no longer match the internal architecture you have been building. That noticing is a form of wealth. It keeps you from compounding losses in the wrong direction. The third dividend is the calm before a decision. Not the absence of uncertainty, but a new relationship with it. You will face a hard choice and notice that the panic you used to feel has been replaced by a slower, more honest assessment. You will ask what you actually know, what you actually need, and what you are actually willing to accept. That calm is not indifference. It is precision. And precision in decision-making is exactly what separates the people who build real wealth from the people who stay busy. Here is the fourth, and it will catch you off guard. You will start attracting different conversations. Not because you changed your clothes or your LinkedIn headline, because you changed the frequency at which you process the world. People with something real to offer will find you more interesting. People who used to dominate the room with noise will stop seeking your approval. This is not luck. This is resonance. Consciousness, once invested at depth, makes you legible to exactly the people you need. Fifth, your appetite for distraction will change. The pull of things that kept you busy but not productive will lose its force. This will happen slowly, so slowly you may not notice until you look back and realize you have not wasted a Saturday in months in the way you used to. The invisible portfolio does not just earn returns, it filters costs. And one of the most expensive things in your old life was all the time spent escaping the discomfort of your own potential. Sixth, and this one matters, your fear of starting without permission will weaken. You used to need someone to tell you the idea was good before you moved. You needed the confirmation, the validation, the external green light. That dependency was not weakness of character. It was the logical behavior of someone who had not yet learned to trust their own assessment. Consciousness investment is, at its core, the practice of developing that trust. And when it matures, you will find yourself beginning things without the usual ritual of hesitation. Consider Marcus. He spent 11 years in logistics management, competent, respected, underpaid, and quietly building what he called his invisible library. A practice of reading, reflection, and deliberate conversation with people whose thinking he could not yet match. He did not have a plan. He had a discipline. One afternoon, a vendor mentioned a supply chain problem in passing, the kind of remark that most people in the room filtered as noise. Marcus heard it as an opportunity. He had spent a decade training himself to hear at that frequency. He spent a weekend writing out what he understood, sent a short note, was invited to consult. Within 8 months, that consultation had become a contract. That contract had become a business. He told a friend later that the breakthrough did not feel like a breakthrough. It felt like recognition. The world finally caught up to something he had been building in the dark. That is what the seventh dividend looks like. Recognition, not fame, not applause. The specific, functional recognition that happens when the world confirms what your invisible portfolio has been telling you about your own value. The reason it does not feel dramatic is because you have been rehearsing it internally for a long time. By the time it arrives externally, you are already past it, already working on the next thing, already compounding. This is the part of the chapter where you need to close the loop. What does it feel like when consciousness is paying you back? It feels like Tuesday. It feels like a meeting that went differently than it would have gone 2 years ago. It feels like a relationship you built because you finally stopped leading with performance. It feels like a Saturday morning where you sat with a hard question and found that the answer came faster than it used to. The dividends are not theatrical. They are structural. They are the permanent upgrades to how you perceive, decide, and act. And those upgrades cannot be taxed, cannot be repossessed, and cannot be inflated away. The compound interest formula from the earliest pages of this book was always pointing here. The rate of return matters less than the consistency of the deposit, and the asset class that rewards consistency more than any other is the one you carry with you into every room, every conversation, every morning decision. The invisible portfolio has been growing since you started paying attention. The only asset that compounds forever is the one you are still becoming. The question the final chapter will answer is not what comes next. It is who receives it. Chapter 14. Taxed on everything except what matters most. Every civilization that has ever risen and fallen understood something about wealth that most people forgot. The ones who built things that lasted, not empires, not institutions, but lives, knew that the most valuable thing a person could hold was not in their hand or in their account. It was behind their eyes. Every culture, in its own language with its own symbols, pointed toward the same recognition. The person who commands their inner world commands the outer one over time. That understanding gets buried. It always gets buried. And then it gets rediscovered by someone who was desperate enough, or still enough, or simply ready enough to see it. You are at that rediscovery now, not as a reader, as someone who has crossed something. The question is whether you know what you are carrying. Here is an open question. It will live in this chapter for a while before it finds its answer. If someone offered you an asset that grew every year without exception, one no government could tax, no market could erase, no inflation could silently consume, would you invest everything you had into it? Most people say yes immediately, and then they spend their entire lives investing in everything else instead. Think about every financial asset you have ever been told to pursue. The house that appreciates. It is also taxed, insured, mortgaged, and vulnerable to the city changing around it. The stocks that compound. They are subject to capital gains, to market panic, to decisions made by people you will never meet in rooms you will never enter. The business you build. It depends on employees, on customers, on regulations that shift with every election cycle. The skills you develop, they depreciate. What was worth everything in one decade becomes a commodity in the next. Nothing outside you is permanent. That is not cynicism. That is the mechanical truth of how external assets work. They are all borrowed. You hold them for a while. Then conditions change, or time passes, or someone makes a law, and the terms of that holding shift underneath you. The external world is not built to give you permanent ground. It never was. The external world compounds your actions. It does not compound you. There is a man named Raymond who spent 11 years building a logistics company in the Midwest. He started with 2 trucks and a client he found through a neighbor. He grew it carefully, reinvested constantly, slept 4 hours a night for half a decade. When his business was worth just over $4 million, a supply chain disruption followed by a regulatory change wiped out his primary contract. Within 18 months, the company was worth a fraction of that. He lost it 2 years later. What he did not lose was how he had learned to think. He did not lose the way he assessed risk, identified opportunity, or stayed calm when numbers moved against him. He did not lose his ability to read a room, to understand what a person needed before they said it, to hold a long view when every pressure around him pushed for short thinking. Raymond started again, not from the same place, from a higher one. Because the asset that had actually compounded during those 11 years was not in the company, it was in Raymond. Let that sit for one breath before you move on. What Raymond's story points to is not resilience as a personality trait. It is something more precise. When you build your consciousness, the way you observe, the way you reason, the way you respond rather than react, you are building something that does not reset when the market resets. You are building something that uses every setback as raw material instead of treating it as a loss. That is not a metaphor. That is a mechanical description of how compounding works when it is applied to the right asset. Remember the compound interest formula from the beginning of this book. A small rate of return, applied consistently over a long enough time horizon, produces outcomes that seem impossible from the starting point. That formula was introduced as a financial principle, but the financial version has a ceiling. It has tax drag. It has sequence of returns risk. It carries the fundamental vulnerability that the principle can be wiped. The consciousness version has none of those constraints. Every insight you integrate raises the base. Every year of honest self-examination, every pattern you catch before it costs you, every decision you make from clarity instead of fear, these are deposits into an account that does not appear on any statement, but they are the most real thing in your financial life. Now stop for a moment. Think about where you were mentally 3 years ago. Not emotionally, not situationally, mentally. Think about the quality of your attention, the speed at which you recognized a bad deal, the clarity with which you understood what you actually wanted versus what you had been told to want. Think about your ability to sit with uncertainty without immediately making a decision to escape the discomfort. How different is that person from the one listening right now? That gap, that specific, measurable distance between who you were and who you are, that is your real return. That is your actual portfolio. And you built it even when you were not trying to. Imagine what the next 3 years produce when you invest in it with intention. Here is where the open loop closes. The reason most people say yes to that question and then do the opposite is not laziness. It is not ignorance. It is that the external asset illusion is total. It is everywhere. Every advertisement, every financial advice column, every dinner table conversation about property values, all of it reinforces the belief that the primary work of your financial life is to accumulate things outside yourself. That belief costs you more than any tax rate ever could. Because while you are focused entirely on the external portfolio, the internal one sits unattended. It does not grow on its own. It does not compound on its own. It requires the same discipline, the same regular contribution, the same long view. The difference is that when you give it that attention, it pays you back in a currency that cannot be inflated away. It pays you back in who you become, and who you become determines everything you touch. Not some things, not most things, everything. The house you negotiate for, the clients you attract, the partners you choose, the risks you correctly take and the ones you correctly decline, all of it is downstream of consciousness. The person who walks into the room with a compounded internal asset is not playing the same game as the person who walks in with only an external one. They see more. They wait better. They act with a precision that looks like luck from the outside and feels like clarity from the inside. Every financial asset you will ever hold is subject to forces you do not control. Tax law can change overnight. Markets can reprice in an hour. Inflation is a slow and patient thief that works while you sleep. Even the most sophisticated investor in the world cannot fully insulate themselves from the vulnerability of external assets. That vulnerability is the nature of the external world. It is not a bug. It is the structure. But consciousness compounds through all of it, through the crash and through the boom, through the loss and through the gain, through the years when nothing seems to be working and through the years when everything does. It is the one thing that does not need favorable conditions to grow. It grows through the unfavorable ones especially. That is the final architecture of everything this book has been building toward. Build the asset they cannot tax. The one inflation cannot silently consume. The one no market correction can zero out, no legal dispute can seize, no partner can walk away with. Build it with the same seriousness, the same regularity, the same long-term thinking you give to any financial strategy that matters to you. You now hold something most people will spend their entire lives looking for in the wrong places. You are the compound.